Members of the head table, academic staff, participants, good evening. My task here is going to be a hard one because I'm the last presenter for the afternoon, at least in this session. So please bear with me while I try to go through as quickly and as interestingly as possible to keep you with me. My paper is going to be based on the patterns of Caribbean livelihoods. So what I want to do for you today is to highlight the issues within Caribbean livelihoods. We want to now bring this into the context of sustainable livelihoods to build and to contribute towards the literature that we would have in the Caribbean. And then we're going to try to do some work on sustainable livelihoods with St. Vincent and the Grenadines and with Grenada. How are we going to proceed? We are going to start by introducing the concept of sustainable livelihood. Then we're going to look at the sustainable livelihood approach as outlined by DFID and IFAD, and we're going to come down to know what those acronyms mean later on, and to at least meet a couple more of those, but we're only going to look at two. Then we're going to take a macroeconomic overview of St. Vincent and then apply the sustainable livelihood approach from an agrarian standpoint. Then we're also going to do this again for Grenada, but again from a fishery standpoint, and then we hope to conclude. So what is sustainable livelihood? According to the Brundtland Commission on Environment and Development, they have some key things inside of there. We want enhanced resource productivity, secure ownership of access to assets, income earnings, focusing on stocks and flows, and all of this to see where we can meet the basic needs of individuals. This came about because we're saying that food production and food security is not really a problem within the Caribbean so much. Well, but it is a problem, but it's an agricultural problem, and that now creates problems for poverty. So we need to put some emphasis on how we deal with this matter. The UNECD in 1992 made the first expansion of sustainable livelihoods in the context of Agenda 21. And they came about with three main concepts within sustainable livelihood which should bring us to that point: development, sustainable resource management, and poverty eradication. So Chambers and Conway in 1992, they gave us a nice definition of what a livelihood and what a sustainable livelihood could actually be. Inside of there, well, I'm going to read the definition so we make sure and get all of it. A livelihood in its simplest sense is a means of gaining a living. A livelihood comprises the capabilities, assets, and activities required for a means of living. A livelihood is sustainable when it can cope with and recover from stress and shocks, maintain or enhance its capabilities and assets, and provide sustainable livelihood opportunities for the next generation, and which contributes net benefits to other livelihoods at the global and local levels and in the short and in the long term. So there would have only been one set of people that would have given us some information on all of this. We have a whole heap of people, including some of our own academic staff from here, Panton et al. 2004, who would have contributed to literature on sustainable livelihoods. But we just want to get what is the main elements of the concept of sustainable livelihoods. We're saying it's going to be derived from a wider set of issues. We have an intergenerational component. We're looking at natural resource usage and management, its linkage to poverty, and social institutions and processes. It's also going to be based on some of the stuff that my colleague Donna spoke about, poverty and environment, but we're going to drill down further into poverty and environment to achieve sustainable livelihoods. We're also going to look at many elements of development, looking at the trade-offs and productivity, equity, and sustainability. Then we have to say that this thing is going to we have to leave some room for negotiation of this term. If we want to apply sustainable livelihoods, we can't take an idea from South Africa and then bring it to Trinidad or to the Caribbean and try to apply it. This thing needs to have some room for negotiation. So now, what is the sustainable livelihood approach? It's going to be a way of thinking. How are we going to develop our priorities? What objectives are we going to use? How are we going to approach the concept of development? The approach is going to be evolutionary. It's not going to be something that we can put all our benefits and say sustainable livelihood would have given us A or B. It's going to be something we can attribute to also to good development practice. It is also an analytical framework. And from this, we have many people contributing towards sustainable livelihood, or many agencies, I should say. We have the United Nations Development Program. We have the Cooperative for Assistance and Relief. We have the Department for International Development. We have the Oxford Committee for Farming Relief. We have the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And the last two, which is the Department for Land Affairs in South Africa and the Danish Funding Agency, would have put together for us the policy guidelines for integrating environmental policy and the learning about livelihoods approach. So from all of this, we have some basic features that each of these different people would have told us about. The focus of a sustainable livelihood approach is going to be based on the livelihoods of the poor. The approach is not going to be a one-sector approach. We have to go in, speak to people, and then they are going to tell us which sector and which entry point to take. The approach is also going to give us emphasis on involving activities for implementation where appropriate to improve livelihoods. So for the purpose of this evening's activities, we are going to look at two sets of people, which is DFID and IFAD. DFID's sustainable livelihood approach is going to be based on a framework. They have tried to put together for us a model of what reality can be. It's not what our reality is going to be exactly. It's what can be. It's going to define the types of assets and access to assets and how those things are going to affect livelihood and individual livelihood security. It's going to look at the connections between the micro and the macro aspects and how it's going to affect us locally and globally. The framework is going to help us to get a checklist of important issues and to build linkages between these issues. It's going to draw important influences and things that we should note. And it's going to look at the interactions between these influences and help us to look at a livelihood. The framework is not a magical tool. It's not going to provide us with everything we need to consider. It's not going to work in a linear manner. It's not going to give us an exact model of reality. And it's definitely not going to define poverty for us. So then what is the framework? It's going to be a planning and assessment tool. It's going to be a way for us to try to look at livelihoods, to put together the components that will affect livelihoods, and how we can use that to try to reduce poverty within the Caribbean. So this is what our DFID framework looks like. We start with the vulnerability context, which can be affected by shocks, seasonality trends, and changes. And then we're going to move towards the different forms of capital. We have human capital, natural, social, and physical capital. But that's going to now translate into or influence the policies, institutions, and processes. That is really the people who would be creating policy or who would be the institutions that will affect the poor. From that now, the poor will determine livelihood strategies, and then we get our livelihood outcomes, the means of maintaining a livelihood. We're now going to go through quickly our IFAD framework. The IFAD framework is really what the development practitioners use. They're saying that DFID's framework had some problems. So how can we improve DFID's framework? They're saying that DFID's framework was too sequential, so IFAD is going to be less sequential. We are going to rearrange the framework, and we're going to unpack the policies, institutions, and processes box using the hub model of institutional analysis.